studied at the University of Cincinnati in the States, studied, I was just told, in the intermediate school at the AA, and also studied at the University of Applied Art in Vienna. In 1993, he founded Veech Media Architecture with Masha. He's taught at Innsbruck University of Technology, at Graz University of Technology, at Vienna University of Technology, and also exhibited and lectured at various institutions around the world.
Okay, let's see if it works. Okay. Okay, that's not going to probably work very well, but I'll just start off with, you see the map here, and I think the map is for us very important. As Natasha mentioned, I came from Chicago, grew up in Chicago. And I think it's quite nice because Sophie talked about bridges, and Chicago has some fantastic bridges, also a lot of skyscrapers. Growing up in Chicago, I was fascinated with SOM architecture, skyscraper, Sears Tower, Hancock Building. And I went to study at Cincinnati, not architects, but urban design. And we dealt a lot more about abstraction, about design, circulation, space between buildings, nothing with facades. And I think to this day, I can always say I'm not really interested in facades. I'm not really interested too much in the skin of the buildings, but a lot more toward program, more toward circulation systems, use of the buildings. The other side of our partnership is Masha Kozmichov. She comes from Moscow, studied in Vienna with Holzbauer, very traditional type education, and left Vienna, a very warm nest, to come to study with Zaha Hadid in 1988. And we both met here at the AA. Basically, I left the States, realized I had to do something different. And the professor I had there said, "You're destined to be a disaster. You're destined to be a disaster because you'll never do the same thing. You'll always change what you want to do. You will never start one thing and finish one thing." And that was like, I think, 1982. And I was pretty horrified. I thought, he is crazy. He's completely mad. So I finished my studies and had interviews with SOM in New York, and they were setting up an urban design department. And then they started going to urban planning, which is more politics and governing systems. And I said, no, I'm not interested. But they really tried to get me to do it. And for some reason, when I finished my diploma, I went to visit my professor, Harris Farouz, and he said, the time is right. I said, what is this? The time is right. The diploma was finished, go get a job and do something. And he said, you're signing this little piece of paper. I said, what is that? He said, it's the application for the AA. And then I kind of said, well, London, why do I want to go to London? And he had shown me a lot of projects back then. And he said, the AA is a great place for you to restart. So, of course, I said, okay, he thought it was a good idea. So I kind of revolted against my family and said, I'm leaving. So I went to the AA, actually to retrain, to rethink things over. And this is 1987. And after 3 weeks being in London, the stock market crashed. So maybe this is kind of a setup for basically how I went from a very organized type of training into the point we're at now, because things always change. And throughout this kind of journey, reacting to certain environments and certain things has greatly influenced our work. To this day, I think, as my children write in their school notes or some of their papers, what does their father do? And my son wrote his first English lesson in Vienna, and said, well, my father's not a real architect. And I actually call myself as a media architect. It's a little bit easier because our office deals with media and technology with the topic of architecture. And we've seen a lot of presentations the last 2 days of everybody who's kind of dealing with architecture in a different way. And that's what's great about the AA. It's also great about London is the topic of architecture is here, but it's not in a traditional sense. So it's kind of nice that we're in Vienna, that we kind of deal with traditional architecture around us. We have nothing to do with it, and we're not really interested in that. I'll show you kind of the beginning. As you see, this is kind of a 10-year span. This is a earlier presentation. Today's lecture will be kind of I don't know, kind of like a cookbook of all our old projects, but it illustrates one thing that's very important. And the reason why did we go to Vienna, because this is always a question everybody asks us. We went to Vienna in 1993 basically for one reason, because we were interested in media. And at this time when the internet was starting and it was a big thing, there was a lot of things with computers, but there wasn't a whole lot of people working as from architecture or architects dealing with media spaces. And we got an offer to work together with ORF Television, to work with Neville Brody, the graphic designer, or the famous star graphic designer, as everybody referred to him. We had a great time. We didn't talk very much in the beginning, and we just kind of came with an idea that we had to work with video wall technology to define a space. So this was completely new territory for us. How do you work as an architect or train as an architect, or in my case, architect and urban designer? But for me, it became much more toward urban design, looking back at it, dealing with buildings in a space, spaces between these objects, and then doing with media, for example, media, in this case projections, but the media screens, to define the space. Very minimalistic, very, at that time, very avant-garde, especially for a Viennese or Austrian television station. But you see how working in a space with cameras, depth of space, as I say, like 2.5D, not real 3D, it's kind of simulated 3D, translated, and the whole question of virtual and reality, or simulated between virtual reality, comes together. And you might say, yeah, okay, it's not so, maybe not so interesting, but it is interesting from one standpoint because A, it's setting up a logic, especially in television, which has really no kind of boundaries of logic. It becomes much more toward entertainment. We've always been much more interested in strategic issues, setting up 5 different programs, 5 different configurations for our very first projects. And we piloted these for 6 months and dealing with aspects of lighting, but mostly dealing with the situation of constantly building up and taking down of the sets. Okay, I'm gonna move a little bit over here. It gives a basis to show what we were talking about back then about how media can define also what we talk about, also about materials. And you'll see in this part, which my topic is dealing with form follows material. Material for us is not in traditional sense materials. It depends on how you address the spaces. One of our projects we did in 2002 was a Newsroom Studio, which is dealing a lot more with, so you see these diagrams here on the bottom, over here, dealing with how you work in the space, how you can, for the camera, how the camera is perceiving the space. Obviously with transmission, satellite transmission, everybody's looking at this space. Too many people every day are looking at the space. The space changes throughout the day. The table's rotating in the middle. The screens are moving. Lighting is different. So it's kind of it has to be a flexible space. It has to be a space which is functioning, which is communicating, or allows the communication of the people who are working in the space. For us, the challenge was to create a space which could always be adapted. We've already gone through 3 different adaptations for the studio. As you'll see here, you see some people sitting here in the space on the bottom. But the idea, the conception of the space was actually just moving walls, a system of moving walls and screens and the moving table. And the only reason we did this was basically because of the lighting situation. Because of rotating the table, go back one thing, I don't know if you can see it, it's too small here in the corner. But the table rotates, and there's always a difference between one person in the studio or maybe 3 or 4 people, depending on how the table is rotated. It always brings you to the center point of the studio with lighting. And if we wouldn't have done that, we would have had about 5 times the amount of lighting. And it was already a structural problem. It was also a problem of the circuits because we had to have way too much lighting hanging up on the grid. We talked last night actually yesterday was dealing a lot with lighting, and for us it was an idea to work with, experiment with light and also materials. Backlighting, different plexiglass things is today not such a big deal, but even 5 years ago, there isn't too many materials which you can use that when it's going over the camera and then being transmitted in PAL format, it's a lot different. There's a big difference between what television somebody's looking at. Are you getting blurriness? Are you getting overlits? For example, burnout, for example, down here, and how the difference, let's say the translation between what you see in front of your eyes and then gets over the camera is a big problem. So, and also scale and the distortion. That's kind of the playground that we've been working since 1993. Completely different studio idea was basically running parallel. We started in 2002 for a project which is dealing with projecting shadows. And you can't have depth of space if you don't have shadows. So we decided we're really fed up with backlit objects, we're fed up with blue or white kind of spacey objects. We decided we wanted a shadow generator. And this was a project which is dealing with using aluminum and actually just bending aluminum with very minimal amount of material, but you can create different shapes very, very simply. And this studio is getting set up every week or every 2 weeks. And basically, it's always changing. So shadows are changing. Different lighting designers come in, light it differently. And with the overlapping projection in the back, you get another feeling of depth in the space with I would say, very conventional, very simple means. But it looks a lot more technical, looks a lot more kind of on the board of a virtual spaces because it's a spatial distortion. This is kind of, we get a little bit more interesting because we're not interested really in design parameters or design, let's say, the design of the surfaces sometimes. Here was a project which we were dealing with an event structure which had to be assembled in one day, actually in the night. The next day it's the museum. It's a museum for technology. There were exhibits everywhere, so you had to basically close down for the day, and at night the lighting was done. And then there was an event for 4,000 guests. So we walked in there, and the first thing we saw were these kind of hanging objects, and I said very simply, we'll just kind of make a floating stage. Well, floating stage in a museum building is not so easy because of all the restrictions they had. And we elevated the island or the stage 7 meters from the floor with using very simple scaffolding members. And there was a rotating stage, which you probably won't see here. There's 5 meter in diameter. And the actors or the presenters were coming up in the back of the form with scissor jacks. And of course, with ideas of lighting and with this fog effect, you couldn't really have a feeling, you didn't have a feeling where this thing was being suspended from or supported from. This is kind of the view here. You see how it works a little bit. This was more of an experiment for us using ready-made technologies. Using ready-mades with adding things, for example, with light projections, fog effects, or whatever. It gives a completely different feeling between high-tech and low-tech. The same thing goes into a project we did in the year 2000. It was for a mobile pavilion. It was actually, we created the briefing ourselves because the client didn't know what they wanted to do. They just wanted to have a terminal that would show up in 9 different places in Austria to promote European communication or the European concept. And we said, that's pretty absurd just to have a terminal. You have to do something else. And very quickly, within about, I think, a 2-month period, they wanted an actual stage, and then they wanted to have a pavilion, and we had to design something very quickly. And design and testing at the same point, because this is not fire-retardant materials, is a big problem. If it would have been fire-retardant materials, it would have been too heavy. You would not have been able to inflate it. We chose only the inflated material because we didn't have to have a lot of structure to hold it up. But it also gave this feeling of the shadows during the day, and at night the glowing effect. I'll show you the video of it. Unfortunately, the floor was not very intelligently done because we didn't have enough time and enough money to do it the right way. We wanted to do it on a trailer, but they didn't have enough money to do it, so it's a steel construction. But the building actually was I think is more interesting the fact it worked on without a logo, without any kind of so-called branding. So kind of against all these kind of marketing guys who always think they have to brand the buildings, and the idea was here to use the technology of the materials or low-tech ideas to be able to solve the problems of building it, constructing it, and also transporting it. But it also became kind of aesthetic for how the building works. We run a lot of these projects parallel, so we're doing sometimes television productions, sometimes events. This is installation, for example, which is dealing with medical technologies and showing them in a museum space. And our problem was that we had two spaces, and we used projection material, material used for video projections, welded together to create kind of a double skin. And in the skin, we put some of the exhibits. Here were some cameras from Lomo cameras. And the idea was to backlight it to get kind of a glowing effect, but also not to span it completely so you would have no wrinkles. The idea was just dealing with the skin and making obviously with medical technology, is the feeling that you have to have a soft surface and not a perfect surfaces. And it was, as you will see here in the video, was moving using very simple means. You couldn't see this on one side of you could enter from two sides, but you couldn't see it from one side because it was completely closed. You see in the model up there? But I always show this video because you see the making of is more important than the finished project, actually. So a lot of the projects we try to also freeze the development of the project, or to show kind of the backstage, or as everybody said yesterday, that the back end of the smart slab is actually quite cool with all the cabling. And here we use it as also an aesthetic to also cast shadows, get a feeling of depth or diffusion, blurriness. But this is more dealing just about how it's constructed. Natasha, is this the sound cable? I have sound in some of the videos and I didn't plug it in. Let's see. No, it's not working. Oh, now it's working. Here you see the shadow effect, because you could see it on one side. You couldn't enter the space. You could only see the people inside, and you had to walk all the way through the other exhibits there to get into the space. So the topic was more about getting efficient use out of a very simple material, welding it, suspending it, but also forcing people to think about circulation a little bit different way. Not letting people just have the easy way. They had to kind of be frustrated and walk out around again. Oops, let me just turn this down. I show this for one reason, because at this point, we had done so much work. We were averaging something like 20 projects or 25 projects a year for a number of years, and I think we realized over 90% of our projects, which sounds like it's a lot, it's great, but then it got really boring because everybody wanted us to do backlit things, kind of spacey things. And this is almost about the time when Tom Barker came to Vienna. And I think it's kind of funny because a lot of our good friends today are everybody who's coming from London to Vienna. And it kind of like made my life a lot easier. Instead of me coming to London, which I love. But it also helps to have guys like Tom who show up. And for example, I think our first meeting, Tom was doing a workshop with my partner at the Saha's class at the University of Applied Arts. And Tom came over to the studio and we just started talking about materials. I think that's when I realized that I have a love for materials and experimentation materials. But Tom brought it down to the point of saying, from the engineering side, but also the fascination of using different materials and just experimenting with it and don't have fear. And I think reducing the fear factor of experimentation is very important, because the Viennese are not very, let's say, avant-garde. They don't like the fact if you say to them, well, we're just experimenting. much like many clients, they won't like that, but I think in Vienna it's pretty much taboo. You'll see why we talk about materials, because our Latent Utopias installation for Graz 2003 was basically, oops, I'm going to move back here again, an experiment in materials that we had never used before. And for a major exhibition of the international avant-garde, to do an installation was pretty crazy if you've never worked with materials. But we were fascinated with the idea of creating, for an exhibition called Latent Utopias, something combining our world of media, but looking at a completely different way. We use computers like everybody else, but we kind of like this analog translation of computer technology. And everybody did animated spaces, everything is kind of rotation and fly-throughs and everything, and we said this is not interesting. Interesting would be to animate the space, to animate a texture in the space, to create a morphed landscape. Just as a kind of a topic, because a lot of people were talking about it at that point, but there weren't too many real-time, let's say, animated spaces. And this was a very big problem. It was a problem because we were fascinated with a very small little piece of rubber. And we were just said, that's what we're going to do. But we're going to scale it up to 6 by 6 floor plan and 4 meters high, and to create this U-shaped space. And we liked this material because you could expand. It could expand something like 300%. And it was a very rough material. It's used for flat roofs. So our idea was the unconventional use of conventional materials, which I think is kind of a stereotypes a little bit of our work because of ready-made materials and ready-made structural elements that we use, for example, scaffolding, but I didn't show it in one of these projects, but a different one where we use it as also as an aesthetic surface or material. And you'll see here, it's not the finished product which is important, it's the process of how to use the material. Just have to wait a little bit here. You're seeing already the finished animations. This was the point. The point was we were in a space with 2 other groups, Ocean North and Servo, and trying to communicate worldwide with these guys what they're going to do. And they just, because they're doing something in white. So we said, well, white. And if we're doing something with backlight and with projections and media things, they said, no, we can't do it. And if this was at the same time when we did a lot of these things, and we said, no, we're doing this black thing. And had long arguments with my partner, and she kept coming back with this little stupid black inflatable pillow that had basically about this big, that was welded in the middle, and you got this incredible distortion in the material. And every time we would design something, she'd come back and say, we're doing that. And we kept saying, we're not doing that, because if it gets, screwed up, we're dead. And I think the only time I ever took my laptop on vacation, I'm not bullshitting, I took my laptop with me, and we just started goofing around one day. And I said, okay, we can try to create something like this without knowing anything about this material. We've done a lot of inflatable things with sewing materials, or I showed you earlier this translucent material, but rubber is a different story. And how do you control this distortion? And how do you control how the material works? And it was a very simple process because we work always with production companies who are doing things. And I think one of the topics that I think is important, people who are talking a lot about technologies and super high technologies. Yesterday, Marie Mahoney talked about her books on technologies and materials. And I like it because it's also what I talk with Tom about, is this low-tech approach. You have to know the people who are working with the materials. It doesn't make any difference to come to some guy and show him this. They said, that's nice. And I said, well, yeah, I know it's nice, but how do we go further on this? And they said, we're going to start doing testing. And this was about, I think we did it one day, and that was it. And we never dealt any more with 3D modeling because it was completely senseless. Because there was no technology that we knew that you could figure out how the airflow was going. And the idea was that you have completely flatly black spanned 3 surfaces, and when the air is injected into it, very primitively, you'll see what happens. Becomes this kind of amorphic landscape. And depending on where the air is coming from, it starts changing at different intervals. And you didn't see this texture when it's completely spanned. It was completely flat, extremely boring. People walked around and said, "What is this shit?" And went right through our space, and then came back around again and said, "Oh, what is that? How did that happen?" The problem was that we were worried about, it was 5 months. This idea of doing an exhibition for 5 months is it's not a good idea. But we ran the risk of doing this one-to-one experiment with the idea is if we don't do the experiment, we're never going to learn anything. And we came with a very simple idea of creating a grid of about 30 centimeter welded joints. And in the welded joints, sometimes, I think you'll see it in this one, the welds actually became a little bit of a problem, and the space or the form started to change, and you get really kind of strange things that were happening like in the 3rd month. As you see there, it got really out of control. You can see like here, there's a really short one. They all were the same length, but because of the wear on the material, it started to change. And I don't think there's be a computer modeling. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe somebody could try to do it, but I think it deals also with the welding of the joints and the heat of the machines that you're using to weld it. But it was kind of, for us, a very good, there you see the whole thing, a very good test with materials. But actually, we didn't do anything more with that material until, I think right now, 2 years later, we decided, well, maybe we go back to it and do some stuff. So there you see the whole process. Just jump ahead on that one. Another project, to go very shortly, it's mainly just an animation, but the idea was that we were asked to do a prototype building for Allianz. Because of our media knowledge and our media studios that we did, they wanted us to create a multimedia environment as a prototype for 10 different buildings worldwide. And the idea was here, as one of the possibilities, for example, more of a horizontal building, glass structure with a vertical plaza. Of course, I envision, of course, from coming from Chicago or being in New York quite a bit, or London, the major urban spaces, and a lot of problem where you'd have in something like this, you would have to say if Allianz would make a building, they need to create, we said to them, they need to create a vertical plaza and to create a space which would be kind of a 24/7 idea, and then this form, which would change in every different site depending on the site constraints, would have a different proportion, but the inside of the building would be projected to the outside, so you could see what's going on. So we did some preliminary studies to show the animation. They liked the concept quite well. There was only one small problem. They lost a huge amount of money in the stock market. And the second problem was they decided that they had a major priority, and that was the Allianz Arena from Herzog de Meuron. And I think that was a good idea, a good decision. I think it was a good result. So actually, I'm not too upset we didn't go forward on the project. For us, it was just looking at the urban scale of buildings and interaction between inside, outside. The idea of prototyping buildings. Can you create identity for a certain building type and then use it for different sites? So that was a kind of a quick project, but it was somewhat satisfying, even though we didn't realize it. A recent project, which was very upsetting, was a project for Mozart. We actually did two proposals. One proposal about a year and a half ago we did for a mobile stage. The concept was for import-export, and we came to the Mozart people who are doing they have a 30 million euro budget to promote Mozart, the Mozart Festival, and we had an idea that you'd create a stage that would link up different satellite cities, and actually we could prove to them that you'd actually make money. And their idea back then was, we don't want to have such a high profile. And that was about, I think, the end of 2003. And I think maybe we forgot that, or we got a little bit stupid, and they talked us into doing a competition about promoting this Mozart festival. And of course, we looked at it, the point would be, that it would be a good idea to use it more as an avant-garde platform for something. And this is also some links back into our discussions with Tom about Smart Slab, and the idea of using it for, maybe not for walls, the walls never interested us, but the idea of using for floors or maybe ceilings, obviously translucency in the material, honeycomb thing is great. And we looked at it as kind of the idea maybe we could use it for structural things. And this project didn't deal with the structure, but it just gave us the idea of the material and how we could use it in an architectural sense. Obviously pixeling, distortion was quite good. And we wanted to create an urban form. I don't want to say urban sculpture because basically I'm not interested in creating sculpture, but it's a sculptural form. But the idea was linking the whole program of what they wanted to do. They wanted a ticket center, they wanted info terminals, they wanted an office space for 4 people, they wanted to have the heating units, the toilets there, they wanted storage space, they wanted communication, they might have wanted sound installation. The only thing they didn't say they wanted video installation. We said, forget it, we give you a video installation, we give you everything else. And we created it with a steel structure and clad it with fiberglass. So the idea was you could, even if they would change their program a little bit, we could change the form because they didn't really have an idea what they wanted. And we wanted to give them a certain form that could adapt to the site, depending on the site. And the site was planned on the left would be, for example, the State Opera House. So obviously there you have to do something completely different. And using the Mozart is much more of an avant-garde sense and saying you can't just play Mozart music. And if you're going to do that for the festival, you're going to lose. So our idea was having the smart slab ceiling up there. You see about 30 square meters to create an urban space for linking up the different events that are going on. To create an urban space, you see with the urban furniture and the whole thing in a steel structure. Of course, nobody was allowed in the building. That's why it would have worked. So it would have been nice to actually go up in the building. We presented it, and then it came back to us after. We had like 2 weeks to do this project. We presented the project, and it came back and said they had to think about it. And I think 4 weeks later, they said, we don't have the 800,000 euro. We have a minus from 4.5 million euro. So they canned the project. So it's pretty upsetting because when the clients come to you and they do competitions and everybody thinks they're going to build it, well, they don't build it. And I'll show you another project which kind of went in the same direction. Basically, they come and get ideas out of you, but they don't realize that they should do their finances before they ask you to do the projects and do business plans. This is a project we did for BMW. We were asked by the group, the headquarters in Munich, to present an idea for the BMW 1. As Tom said yesterday, this was his last piece of engineering, one of his last pieces. Very honored because Tom helped us a lot on this project. Obviously, when you're doing a pitch for a project, you have 3 weeks, and you're dealing with some guys like BMW, and if you don't figure out in this 3 weeks that you're doing it, you have about 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes to explain them exactly what they want to see, or explain your ideas very quickly. And we said the first introductory was the car and the material of the car has to get into the materials of the building. And they've done some buildings which are quite interesting for the materials, but a lot of the buildings they use for the exhibitions is very basic, like almost like a black box, I call it, but it's just a box. It might be more interesting if it's a black box, but they just didn't get the idea. And we said if you're going to do the BMW 1 presentation for a traveling show of 20 different European cities, and you're promoting the BMW 1, you better be careful because it's not about doing aesthetics. It's about positioning your product. They gave us the plan, and they basically thought we just would put some kind of digital monitors in there, put some printed surfaces on it, and that's finished. And we said, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing it because it's completely wrong. Because their briefing was they're going to do it on test tracks. They're going to do it in Imola. They're going to do it also, I mean, if you're going to do an event and do it on a Formula One test tracks, and the idea to take the BMW 1 car out and go zooming around, you can't have a box sitting on the ground was our thing. It just didn't fit. And we talked with Tom about different things, and we were emailing things back and forth. And Tom had a great thing. We said, Tom, we want to do kind of suspend the structure, and you see kind of these are the first things here. And Tom said, well, it can be done. I think you can see some of his notes. He started calculating it. He said, it's a nice problem. And I love that comment from Tom, because the nice problem became more of a motivation for us to solve the problem. The problem was not the structural thing. The problem was we're presenting to these guys who basically want to throw you out in 5 minutes if you don't explain your idea. So we just zipped through the whole thing and got to this diagram and said that they're, oops, I went too fast. They wanted to have a garage on the side, and they'd talk about BMW. They have the briefing was, half of their briefing was about how many people get in the car and go drive around, and how many cars they wanted to sell. They didn't talk about the building. They didn't talk about the expectations. They didn't talk about the idea what should happen there. They just talked about money. They talked about statistics. And we had the idea was saying, forget the garage. BMW 1 doesn't get in the garage. Forget the whole statistics. What we wanted to do was take this so-called garage, as they said, and bring it to the center of the building. You bring the product to the middle of the building in their so-called lifestyle lounge, which is elevated above. You have a terrace below, so you have this already separation of the user. And the idea was bringing that car in there and creating an expectation of how much do you really want to get into that car, let alone, okay, you get information, but the main thing was saying, to build the expectation, I want to get into the car, I want to do the test driving. So it seemed like a very okay thing. And we talked to them, we showed them a little bit of a model, they were a little bit happier, but they didn't really get it. They didn't get the idea too much until we showed them the animation. So I have to jump around a little bit because putting all these presentations from a lot of different presentations is always exciting. The idea was to bring the car to the middle of the building, obviously test driving, suspended, or say elevated structure, looking at the skin of the building, which we looked at different things, either hard top or soft top, maybe inflatable, depending on the structure. And Tom and I were talking about making a very lightweight aluminum structure, but the trick was, how do you build it? In the video you see how we thought about it. We thought basically, stop here, that there would be a platform in the middle. The platform would allow you to build the building on the ground very quickly, bring it up, and then stabilize it with secondary construction. Sorry. So to argue with them that you could actually build it relatively fast, because there'd be no way to build an elevated structure within, I think they wanted it done like in 2 days. But the idea was to use the problem of building of time, to use it as a principle for the building. And I think this is probably one of our more interesting projects, because you see it here, you see all the problems you're dealing with. The last is, of course, for us is the aesthetic thing. The whole problem was dealing with them is cost, efficiency, time of building things, what kind of materials you can use, how does it fit to their briefing. And this kind of blew them away, because they started to argue the fact of, is it important for them to have 8 people getting in the car at the same time? Is it important to have 1 person in the car? Do they sell more cars if they have 1 person getting in there, which is the BMW 1? And this kind of triggered, I think, it was about 3-month-long discussion, and they had wanted to already start building this thing. So they came back to us and said, sorry, we haven't decided on the project, because we have problems, internal problems about the strategy of this whole event because of your presentation. And they actually canned the whole presentation. They never realized in this scale at the roadshow. So I don't know if that's kind of good or bad, but it just shows you that through design issues or a design approach or strategy, you do influence a lot what the client actually has to decide. To show this quickly, because this is a current project which we're working on. It's a house. We looked at a prototype housing. We were approached by a client about 1.5 years ago to do manufactured housing, prototyping. And our idea was, how can you expand a house? How can you create a 3D form? Because at this point, we looked a lot at buildings outside of Austria, let's say outside of Vienna even, that they're always unfinished. And we like this unfinished aesthetic where you have the insulation on the outside of the building, but somehow these buildings are like staying there like for years, and they were never finished. And I mean, if you travel in Italy, you see also building just the concrete structures just in the landscape and kind of abandoned structures. And we thought maybe we could create an aesthetic for a 3D facade that would allow you to, for example, in the plan, for one building, use it as a small structure, having a supply core, using the same geometry to create, say, a double unit or another one. And we looked at very quickly, what happens if you're creating the same, let's say, the same radius of the curves, but just changing the profiles, and how much that changes your building. So a little bit more studies of 3D situation. And if you get really kind of more toward the old G4 approach of how the things look, more kind of curvature, it didn't really matter too much for us about something like this, what is the form, but it was the idea of having vertical slits, the idea of extending your building later on. If you had more money, you could actually extend your building out, which I thought was kind of a nice approach. Or in this situation, looking at integrating solar panels, if you used span membranes, that you could actually have solar panels on your building, and what kind of textures you could use. Well, we were a little bit naive to the whole problem of finding a company who would agree to provide us with a material which is not using, for example, this rubber material to span it, but to coat the exterior surface for walls and roofs. And we're still fighting to find somebody who will do it. But as you see here, the aesthetics can be quite interesting, very industrial. I mean, it's not that much toward housing, or say, this is, for example, for an artist studio, so it's okay to get a more industrial look to it. We looked at also using concrete. The problem is the site is you have to go through a forest to get there, so it became very, very much of a problem. So we're looking at kind of trying to figure out a low-tech approach to it, and maybe doing a 3D milled facade and then coating the building. And this brings me to the point why I'm interested also to work together in the network, because in collaborative issues of talking about how to produce buildings, and Tom and I talk a lot about these things, finding a material which you can coat the walls or the roofs of things like this. There aren't too many manufacturers who will guarantee this, and that's why you need to work in different kind of research groups or collaborative networks, because somebody might have an idea, somebody might have a lead for you. So let me oops. Things are getting messy on the desktop here. You see the early working models. We did a lot of models and trying to figure out this point. This started actually after our latent utopias, the black model, the black installation. So we were looking at maybe spanning the material. We got away from that and said maybe we should just use the insulation as an aesthetic for the building. That's the animation. But now it brings up the big project. One of the biggest projects we're working on right now is dealing with media. It's dealing with, I would say, animated parts of buildings. And sometimes it's nice to be part of symposiums and to present your work, but sometimes it's not a good idea when you present after one of the top engineering companies basically says moving buildings don't work. And whether or not, maybe I'm the flapping airplane pilot right now, I don't know. Maybe Tom will support me a little bit at some point. But our idea was looking at material, connecting with program, but let's talk a little bit material. Material for us could be, for example, media. Going back to the earliest projects we worked with Neville Brody with, is dealing with digital media. And we thought, why don't we use the Smart Slab product as a surface, as a form of digital media to create communication. A lot of people talked about communication in the last 2 days, but interaction and communication. We're looking at dealing with television media, digital channels, and also IPTV, if anybody knows what we're talking about. It's dealing with linking up, let's say, Vienna to London, to New York, to Japan. We're working with different companies about this, which is not such a big deal. But our idea with the building was taking an existing building, and as you see here, creating, as I say, programmatic. It's not a design right now. It's not a structural principle. The idea here is to create a building form which is changing how this building is working, how the circulation is changing, how the circulation is actually working in the building by saying one floor, one unit is moving up toward a certain level and changing the programmatic relationships of the building. This is a very simple schematic of what we were trying to do. You kind of wonder why we're doing that. So we just show the reason why we're doing it. We're taking an existing building, it's called the Künstlerhaus, so a building with artists. And there are three main parts of the building: exhibition, a big, quite large exhibition space, theater space, and cinema. And we're adding the fourth element, new media. And new media, as I said, can be broadcast technologies, can be internet-based things. And in this case, this project has nothing to do, for us, nothing to do with aesthetics, nothing to do with architecture and design. It's a project which we've developed with a cultural friend of ours who works in a lot of cultural institutions in Austria. And we basically had this idea that in all these museums, even, for example, Kunsthaus Graz, the facade of the building looks great, but the interior is another issue. The materials of the building is another issue, but the whole problem is the program, or what's happening in the spaces. You expect from Kunsthaus Graz that basically you're linking up all over the place, would have high-tech facilities, which it doesn't have. So we looked at this project completely differently, that we create the briefing. And the funny thing is that we actually did create the briefing. We did show this presentation to the mayor of Vienna, and we're kind of at the right place at the right time, because he loved the project. It's one of the major urban places in Vienna. And you see how these buildings, this conglomeration of different building types are here. And he kind of saw this as a new solution for an urban space, even though it's one of the highly, let's say densely traveled things with, for example, the subways directly connected here. And we decided to bring this all together with this new media stuff underground. And for us, it was an idea of how to use a strategic principle of the building elements and bring it together and basically writing a story. And yesterday, Stefano was talking about form and fiction. Basically, writing briefings or rewriting the briefings is kind of what we always love to do. And this was a perfect example of taking the time to do it and to decide it's really important. Because, let's show a few videos of what it looks like. You see some images. The idea was creating a new glass form on the left side of the building to create an asymmetric situation. You see it down here. The building is really worthless. Its building has been changed every 20 years. Some architects have always decided to redo it. I mean, it's worthless in the sense it has no, we say, has no historic value, because in Austria, especially in Vienna, every second building has historic significance. You can't do anything with it. And we decided the only way we could do something here is either to create something completely unique or completely kind of off the wall. Otherwise, we'd get killed, because especially with historic preservation, it means that they would actually kill anything we would propose, anything which was dealing with glass, anything dealing with the topic of I don't know, let's say modern situations in the first district of Vienna's basic taboo. And we decided to argue the point of a building which is using the idea of showing the function of the building, kind of, which was funny enough because Pompidou is for us incredibly interesting because you have a lot of different elements of the building, the program of the building, but showing the function on the outside of the building for us is not so interesting. The circulation through the different parts was interesting. And doing it or interpreting it a different way, and I never knew that actually Pompidou was with moving floors. That was kind of funny to find that out today. We look at more the idea of the Fun Palace from Cedric Price, and the Fun Palace idea seemed to be for us a lot more of an idea of how to address a building like this, not in concrete detail, but the idea was to show what's happening in the building in a formal sense. In fact, you see this building form, this lounge, which is going to different levels. You see it on a lower level, for example, exhibition opening, but also showing the content or the media, what's happening in the building or in a satellite location. And that's why I love this product, Smart Slab, because basically you could do it. And it was not, in this video, it's not the idea that's like it's a giant lift or elevator, you're going to be in the building. It just shows the principle. You could kind of move to different levels. But you'd have actually exposed the program of the building to the outside and use video walls, or say in this case the Smart Slab, but not as a horizontal surface as a wall, but using it up there. Let's say it's a vertical surface. We want to use it horizontal surface as a ceiling, as a digital sky, to link up what's going on in the building, or maybe link out what's going on outside, and to create a building form which would be hard for the historic preservation guys to argue, because the building was always in transition. And the first phase was actually, we didn't even have the glass box. We wanted to have just the form which was going up and going down, and actually getting submersed in the ground. And as an analogy to saying the building is there, but it's not there. The other thing we kind of took liberties, we took out the central stair and moved the circulation to the outside and put a digital floor here. So you had a digital floor and a digital ceiling that would actually show more of the internal communication stuff which is going on, maybe what's going on in the cinema or the theater. And also to have it as interactive spaces for artists, who would be, for example, artists in residence, or using with virtual technologies that they could actually interact with the spaces or the surfaces. And I think we've seen a lot of things in the last 2 days where there's some really great stuff going on. Crispin's ideas of interaction with mobile phones and in watches. Obviously, it's kind of clear with something like this, if you give it to creative people, they have a huge amount of possibilities. We look at ourselves as architects or media architects who are giving platforms for different people to interact and to use the technology, and less of guys who are going to tell you how to do it. And to conclude, my short presentation, my presentation today is basically, I think it's really important to look at materials and look at technologies, but also look at the analog and digital approaches. And by doing very, very simple tests, as you see here, I think it's important that you see that you have to kind of fuse both things together. And sometimes you have to have guts to be maybe the flapping airplane to try to promote something and to try to get people to do it, because everybody will say it can't be done. So I just hope that in our research network we find enough people who have enough knowledge or enough know-how who can actually help everybody else and communicate and collaborate on different type of projects in order to solve or to move a little bit further in the future to realize some of these things. Thank you very much.